Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Testing Tips and Tools podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Apple Tools, which provides owl-powered visual testing for web and mobile apps. So thank you, Apple Tools, for sponsoring. Today, we have our special guest. His name is Jarrod Overson. Jarrod Overson works for Shape Security. Thank you, Jarrod, for visiting us today.
Thank you for having me. This is exciting.
Absolutely. And we have Amit Zur, which is going to be our host. Amit works for Apple Tools. So thank you, Amit, for hosting. We appreciate you.
Sure, Kelly.
Perfect. So we're going to go ahead and get right into everything. I will go ahead and leave Amit's and Jarrod's at names in the description box and the descriptions of the podcast as well. Okay. Go ahead, Amit. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And today's episode, this is number 2 in our front-end testing tools and tips. We're going to talk today with Jarrod, who is a very, very interesting persona. Quite an amazing resume Jarrod has. Today, he's a director of engineering for Shape Security, but also maintaining a very active blog, organizing a co-organizer of QCon conference in the past, JavaScript U. He's an author of a book published by O'Reilly about web components in the past, plus an organizer of 200 plus regional meetups around San Diego, San Francisco. Did I get that correctly, Jarrod?
that seems high. I'm not sure where that number came from. There are over 200 individual meetups, but not 200 meetup organizations in that area.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. As long as you use the best metric that you can have to make it sound great. But overall, very impressive resume, and you've been around for a very long time. I've read a lot of your content on your blog, writing a lot about web security. So very interesting stuff, I recommend. Let's talk about testing today. So we'll try to zoom in and get your perspective on things. So let me first ask you, can you share a little bit of what you're doing at Shape Security in the aspect of testing and how you see it, how you influence your organization on the aspect of testing quality?
Yeah, absolutely. So testing in general is one of those things that I'm very passionate about as a developer. Over the course of the past, I guess, 10 plus years now, I've been investing more and more heavily in different types of testing. But I had an opportunity at Shape Security to move into people leadership and management. And that was a very interesting experience, moving away from being hands-on with code and being able to drive it in the direction that I feel it should go, to having to influence a number of people and eventually a number of teams in order to get them to understand and subscribe to the same types of passion and ideas that I had. And that was a very, very different task that I learned a lot. I learned a lot about people. I learned a lot about software, and I learned a lot about leadership. But I also learned a lot about how people perceive testing in a bunch of different ways. There are people who perceive it as just kind of another chore, and as long as you have the code coverage you're looking for, then you have succeeded in your chore. And then there are people who use it to build out confidence of the system. And there are people who aggressively test aspects that I wasn't even aware were testable in the way that they were testing. So it's been a very, very interesting decade of testing for me. And we at Shape Security do a lot of I guess, edge case things with the web. We protect websites against automated attacks. And the way we do that is by doing a lot of crazy things with JavaScript. So we also deploy JavaScript to a whole number of third-party websites, our customers. So dealing with very, very crazy JavaScript on sites that you don't own means that you have to be very aggressive and very thorough in your testing, because if you deploy somewhere and you take down a website for even 5 minutes at a Fortune 500 company, that might be millions of dollars. And you don't want to be the one that is being pointed at when something like that goes wrong.
Right. So basically you would have, do you have like a a suite of these edge cases being automatically tested that sort of cover many of the aspects that that define the web, like, and different characteristics of very different websites?
We do have a large suite of regression tests. Unfortunately, with some of these edge cases, given the way the World Wide Web works, for anyone who's been writing web applications for longer than 3 to 6 months, recognize it as basically the Wild West. And as long as you get something working, then you kind of walk away and hope nothing breaks, and it continues to work forever. So that style of application development over the course of the past 10 years has led to a bunch of applications that all work in very, very different ways. And some of them are even built to also account for bugs in the application or bugs in the browser, which means that your code has to account for their accounting of a bug. And we often, we can't predict things like that, unfortunately. So we do flesh out a substantial regression suite in order to make sure that when we do find something, that particular bug can't pop up again over time. We also certainly test with a lot of canary browsers to make sure that we're ahead of changes in the browser before they roll out to the general public. That catches a lot of edge cases. Even browser makers and browser developers may deploy a version that has some weird edge case that most people would not ever come across, but because of the way we work and what we do, we find.
So do you have, and take the risk of maybe you're not in a position to share, but like a concrete example of something wacky that some website does and that breaks the way that you're working, or vice versa?
Yes, absolutely. So for websites, we've seen excellently, incredibly well-built websites, and we've seen websites that turn themselves into Ajax-y single-page applications by just having some JavaScript that makes a request for the same pages they used to have, and then they just document.write over their own page in order to produce the new experience. And that level, we hadn't seen that before. And when we saw that, we certainly weren't accounting for everything that exists in the page to be gone and then rewritten with something else and have mixing of JavaScript contexts and environments and global variables. That was a surprise. That was certainly a unique one.
Thereby also deleting your script, right?
Oh yeah, that was reload our script again. But we have a bunch of checks for that because that's one of those things that is not entirely uncommon. But there was an issue with Firefox, I think 43 or something along those lines, where one of the invariants in the browser API changed slightly and caused an issue with our script. And with the way browsers work, it was an issue for a little while. We worked around it, and then it magically resolved itself because of evergreen browsers. So it was easier to just wait than to roll something else out.
Good strategy. So actually, that's an interesting point. If you've set an interval in a page and then the page document writes everything, does your interval still work?
That's a good question. I would guess that it would. Yes.
Interesting.
I want to test that out right now. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, me too. So you've that's indeed a wacky. That's a very good answer to the question of a wacky scenario that what they just do. So that these things are pretty hard to test. But I want to touch on something that you've said earlier, which was that you've moved from being an engineer to a managerial position and brought with you your passion to testing. So I think that's also a shift that our industry is going through, where if we traditionally spoke about managers being like the position that sort of we need to convince in order to test, we see more and more engineers turning into managers who know and understand the lower level resolution of why tasks matter. So I'm curious what conflicts in terms of organization or personal or or just in a perception of one's work, you've encountered what conflicts in the aspect of convincing people, and how do you convince people that tests matter?
Well, certainly, convincing people that tests matter is different depending on the personality and role that you're targeting. If you're targeting the executive team or teams that aren't necessarily heavily technical, then it's a matter of just setting expectations. I've found if you set expectations appropriately, then testing is just part of the cost of developing software, and there's really not much of an option of skimping out on just the cost of developing software. So as long as you can set those expectations early enough, then when it's done, and you move on. I think a lot of the problems with a lot of the problems that I've seen arise around testing are very, very much deeply rooted in a mismanagement of expectations. And I think that's common with developers because they're often seen as the sources of truth for when something is quote unquote done. And it's easy to see the scope of the work that you have in front of you, to know when you might be done with that, to describe that as the answer to when something is done, but not fully account for all the extra work that goes into making sure it's a solid piece of code, a solid feature with all the tests and documentation necessary. So when you present a date or a duration as when something is going to be done, and then when you get there and you describe a whole load of extra work that is important, then it sets everyone off. And unfortunately, because tests and documentation and all those things like that are not necessarily critical for the actual value delivery for a company, it's easy for executives or VPs or managers or whatever else to just say, release it and move on, because they see what they want to see without understanding the implications of having an unmaintainable code base over the course of months or years.
Yeah, agreed. And I agree that tests are reside in a category that's reserved for, like you say, documentation, but also performance or accessibility, which are not the core, which do not, traditionally define the core functionality. So you sort of have an obligation to deliver some sort of functionality, and it's easy to not ship this with documentation, with a performant way to run this functionality, with proper accessibility for people with disabilities, and so on. So yeah, it's very easy. And I've actually experienced this also from a personal, my own personal experience, where as an engineer, it's a bit hard to get effort estimations and add that line of, write tests, which adds more days. And as a manager, even, it's you see this and you're inclined to say, how can we make this ship a little bit faster, and requires really strong personal abilities, which are not technical, to make the case and stick with it. And I think it's only engineers that have suffered the aches who can have a strong enough emotion towards this to really stick with it in the hard case, when it's when you're cornered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why I initially, 10 years ago, when I was really, more than 10 years ago, where I was introduced to testing and really how deep it went, and started to learn more about test-driven development and how those concepts can be applied to everyday development. I initially wasn't bought in. I understood tests, I understood their usefulness, but test-driven development seemed a little bit too aggressive. And now, over the course of 10 years, I see the value of making sure that tasks that could be left to the end are integrated in the daily routine, in order to make sure that you always have a sense as to how big the scope is of what's left, because you're working on everything at once, and you can't omit something, or you can't present an expectation that omits a major part of the application, because it's just part of your daily life. So Same with documentation generation, test creation, integration tests, making sure that those are all baked into the process of development so that you can't go too long and see that as just a weight that is dragging down the delivery.
So how do you maintain that that dependency? So, which is a different way to ask, what is test-driven development for you, and how do you make sure that tests are integrated into your daily development routine?
So I used to be a very solid proponent of test-driven development, and I still am, but now I recognize that I need to qualify it a little bit. I'm a proponent of goal-driven development, where you have a long-term goal that you can't get to in the short term. It's too abstract, it's too far, it's too big. You need to break that up into milestones or whatever you call it that give you the opportunity to assert your confidence that you're going in the right direction. And from those milestones, you get sprints in an agile world or something like that. And then you keep on breaking those down until you get to the smallest chunk of work that provides you some ability to assert that you are going in the right direction. And for me, I've found that to be a documentation, a little bit of documentation or a test. And the documentation might be how you run the command or how you access an API. And then that might translate into a test. And you can write that first. And then the test is a codified form of an assertion. So then you can write code in order to make sure that your assertion passes. That is test-driven development is a part of that. But test-driven development without the understanding of where it fits into the broad scope of goal-driven development ends up losing a bit of its value because it's very narrowly scoped.
So in essence, you mean that in test-driven development, you actually say like it's also test first, and in many cases, what you're saying is I'm going to write a test just as a way to assert that what I'm trying to do is indeed valid and takes me in the right direction.
Yes, it's testing that. I guess take into consideration creating something that is meant to be consumed as an API, either a library API or a REST API or something like that. When you're developing it strictly to be consumed. And if you develop without testing the interface, then you're developing with a lot of assumptions as to how that interface is going to be used. It's a lot better and produces much better APIs when you can describe the interface in advance and then develop towards that specific interface that you've already settled on. Because it's not no matter how easy or intuitive many people think it is to create APIs, once you actually apply or once you actually try to use them, your perspective changes. And understanding understanding that perspective first is an incredibly important part of building software that scales, because then you don't have to go through a big refactor phase.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good practice in general. It probably applies to maybe all the aspects of life, to just put yourself in the head of the consumer before you're producing anything. So question remains, how can you manage to make these things a consistent part of the routine that developers among members of a large team of developers? Is it through tooling? Is it through culture? Is it through I don't know, metrics or whatever?
It's a bit of all of the above. With any sort of topic like this, which has a lot of opinion and personality behind it, making sure that whoever is, I guess, giving the green light or the red light is a computer as opposed to a person is a really important part to making sure that everyone is on the same page. So as a topic of code coverage, which is a way for people to figure out how many, what percentage of code they're testing has actually been run with tests. Now, code coverage as a metric alone is not necessarily the most valuable thing in the world, because some things just don't need to be tested, and just striving for 100% code coverage is not necessarily the most important thing in the world. But code coverage as a metric that can be built into a continuous integration or continuous delivery system is valuable, because then you can make sure that code coverage doesn't drop below a certain point, or if somebody's submitting code is actually adding tests because they can't submit a feature that drops code coverage below a certain point. So it's one of those fuzzy metrics that that also has a lot of personality and opinion behind it. But making sure that there are tools that can block code that should not be put into a code base from getting into the code base is important. So it's not just that jerk manager says I have to do it this way.
Yeah, makes sense. So how much time does this type of check that gives a green or red light take at shape, for instance?
Are you asking how long like an actual build process takes?
Yeah, the one that's, you know, like build on the continuous integration, if there is one, or like I'm a developer, I've just pushed some code, I want to see that light if it's green or red. So what's my feedback loop?
So there shouldn't be a time where a developer has to push something to a continuous integration platform in order to get the early feedback. There should be a way to run a large portion of tests on the local machine in order to make sure that there is a significantly decreased likelihood of having an issue in a build platform. But you can't test everything locally, or well, it is you run into a cost versus value problem if you keep on trying to make everything testable locally. So at some point, you probably just have to wait for a system that is more maintained. And that the answer to your question is it depends on that system. Unfortunately, with web testing, there are a lot of environments and a lot of devices and a lot of browsers, and the testing of all those browsers, devices, and environments is something that leaves there's not a perfect solution that exists out there, and I'm sure you have some opinions as to maybe things that I could try. I think right now we're using one of the common services out there that allow you to spin up a whole load of devices and browsers, and that can take quite a bit of time. If we go through the entire test suite on a release or something like that, that can take upwards of an hour, which is too long.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's definitely a very challenging landscape, as opposed to, I think, maybe in back-end development, where things are a little more, I'd say, predictable or easy to structure, and the wild web is indeed the Wild West. So do you feel there's something that you can pinpoint as missing in this tool chain that we have for front-end testing? Something that you wish we had, and if we had it, life would be much easier?
I mean, certainly a way to very rapidly spin up any environment that is necessary and run tests and get responses in a very, very quick period of time. All asynchronous and all magically very fast. That would be beautiful.
Yeah, I concur. So, I mean, how do you feel about just a strategy where you do like the bulk and the core of your, I mean, you described it. Developers have some core suite of tests that they run locally before they push, and then there's the full regression, which is always much longer. Is there some strategy about like using, when I run my test locally, when do I use browser automation versus when do I do something that's virtual, like JS DOM, or even write my code in a way that's not dependent at all in a browser?
Oh, absolutely. So I think that that's where a lot of testing should move to, especially when it comes to browser testing. Is just remove the browser from the equation. There are many instances where a substantial portion of logic can be extracted into something that does not rely on the DOM or browser APIs at all. And whenever that can be done, that should be done in order to make sure that tests run much more quickly, or are more deterministic, and can be more portable across a bunch of different platforms without relying on how you can get access to a browser. And there are many tools out there that can make that easy. I rely still quite a bit on Mocha and its related libraries, and that's something that I feel like whenever possible, the UI code should be kept to an absolute minimum, and then the testing of UI code should be done in an isolated sandbox in order to make sure that what you're testing is just the UI component and not the state of an application or the state of a browser.
Yeah. So and I've seen on your blog that you mentioned Puppeteer a lot. Is that something you leverage in your tests?
Yeah, Puppeteer is fantastic. If anyone listening has not played with Puppeteer, it's highly recommended, because I've been in the web for so long, and I've been dealing with this test topic for so long. I've gone through the dealing with whatever Java-based tools existed out there, and then Selenium, and trying to build up Selenium clusters, and dealing with WebDriver, and then Phantom.js, and then all the iterations of all those things. And it's just, they were good at the time for what was out there, but they were a less than pleasant experience when it came to automating a browser. Puppeteer is just beautiful. It's an intuitive API. It is Node first. It runs either its own Chromium that it downloads for you, or production Chrome, as long as the APIs line up, which is the browser that the majority of the world uses. So you're automating in a nice way a browser that your users are likely going to use, which gives you the ability to test very early, and very easily. And Chrome also supports a headless mode, so you can run this on your CI platform very easily, or in the cloud on Google Cloud Functions or something like that, extremely easily. So Puppeteer is one of the more exciting things I've come across in the past few years, which might be I guess telling you a little bit of how exciting I am at parties.
Yeah, but Puppeteer is exciting. I think in this territory, I agree with everything that you just said. They also have very cool APIs for whatever is in the dev tools of Chrome. Seeing all unused CSS, whatever information Chrome DevTools shows you, you can consume via Puppeteer. So it's super nice, not just for testing. On to something a little different, which is you have a strong background and you're doing today a lot of security stuff. Is there an aspect of testing that's special to the world of security? Do you have like more tests that are checking to see like penetration tests, or things that make sure that what you are building is secure or not, jeopardizing the web pages where you are hosted or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is nothing I'm going to talk about is specific necessarily to my role or security in general. It's something that should be applied widely, but we've had to take special care to focus on it. So we at Shape have built a reverse proxy that consumes traffic and sends it off to the origin web servers. And we also, with our JavaScript, we built a JavaScript compiler that compiles JavaScript down to bytecode and then runs on a virtual machine that happens to be implemented in JavaScript. Then this is what's sent down to the client. So both those aspects rely on the reverse proxy relies on consuming the entirety of HTTP traffic that might exist, and the JavaScript compiler relies on properly compiling any JavaScript that could exist in the world. Whenever you're dealing with situations like that, it is extremely unlikely that you're going to be able to account for every possible iteration of infinite data. And there are tools that are called fuzzers that make this a little bit more manageable. So fuzzers, if you're not familiar with it, are the automatic generation of arbitrary or pattern data that you can use as input to things like a reverse proxy or a compiler, so that you can just generate millions or billions of iterations of data in order to make sure that it behaves how you expect it to behave. And this is a concept that is should be probably more applied to general web development, because there's so many things can happen on a web page. A person might leave a browser open for 6 months and then try to use your application. When you're writing tests and you're writing unit tests or anything in traditional manner, then it's easy to just account for the cases that you expect to account for. It's not entirely common that you're gonna spend a lot of time thinking about all the edge cases that might exist, and that's where fuzzers come into play, because you don't need to account for that yourself. You can have a program generate all this data for you.
Super interesting. So, is there like an off-the-shelf products that you use, or libraries, or whatever, or you've written your fuzzers yourself for your fuzzy testing?
So there are definitely fuzzers out there. You're probably going to need to look for a specific fuzzer for the type of logic you're trying to test. If you're trying to test HTTP traffic, you're going to need to you need to have a fuzzer that's specific to HTTP requests. There's a great one out there, but I cannot remember it off the top of my head. But if you Google HTTP fuzzer, it's bound to be the first 1, 2, or 3 results. Then there's a bunch of penetration testing tools, which are also useful for web developers to know, in order to make sure that you're not developing in a way that allows these penetration tools to find a vulnerability. So there's one, I believe it's called WFuzz. I think it might be a Python project, but it allows you to essentially fuzz a bunch of HTTP requests towards a web application in order to see whether or not any of those requests respond in an unexpected manner.
Interesting. So did you start out with these fuzzers, or did you like start development, then saw that you're trying to handle so many cases, and then realized that a fuzzer would come in handy?
So fuzzers I've found more useful as projects get to completion, because they're generating a large amount of data that is appropriate for consumption by whatever you're building. So like, let's say take the HTTP fuzzer, for example. Like if we're building an HTTP server or reverse proxy or anything like that, as we're going through development, we might be supporting different features at different times. A fuzzer is going to try to generate anything, and you should be able to consume that. So as you get closer to the end, they become more relevant, but you can apply that topic to early development, or apply that theory to early development with generative testing. And there are a bunch of libraries that help with this, and they allow you to randomly generate the type of data that your unit tests might be consuming. So it might just be integers between 100 and 250 or something like that. And that allows you to write tests in a way where they don't rely on any hard-coded values. You can just generate the values and then assert that the logic did something to those values in a way that you would expect. And that's a great way to essentially fuzz logic at a much lower level.
What do you mean fuzz logic at a much lower level?
Sorry, fuzz input. So you're fuzzing input, but it's much more constrained.
Yeah. Got it.
Like if you're fuzzing, like with the JavaScript tooling we built, like we built a JavaScript parser and transformation library. What we want to fuzz as input is any valid JavaScript program. But for each individual, let's say if we're parsing a JavaScript into an AST or something like that, our unit tests might be parsing whether or not a string with double quotes gets parsed properly. We can use a much smaller function to generate random string data into our logic that's parsing that, as opposed to worrying about generating an entire JavaScript program.
Got it. So I have to deviate a little bit from the testing subject because you've mentioned something that's super interesting to me to hear about. So if you're willing to share, what exactly is that JavaScript compiler that you're doing? What's its role? Why are you doing this?
Yeah, sure, gladly. Like I mentioned early on, Shape is a company that produces a product that blocks automation against websites. So things that might be automated are like a login form. So people who get billions of email addresses and passwords, they might automatically try to input those to test out which users have reused their passwords so that those accounts can get taken over. And the way we protect that is by deploying magical JavaScript. But if you're trying to attack a website and you know what that JavaScript's doing, then you can bypass those protections much more easily. So the JavaScript compiler early on, several years ago, was the first step at producing a solution that more effectively protects JavaScript so that we can obscure its intent. You're unable to reverse engineer the bundle that we send down into the actual JavaScript that was used to generate it. So you're already working with a handicap when you're trying to reverse engineer it. And then just by dealing with bytecode in general, we can unlock decades of bytecode obfuscation and protection research and apply that to the client side. So we've done that over the course of several years. And what it's enabled us to do is to iterate very rapidly and very secretly with attackers. So it allows us to go faster and attackers to go slower. And when you're dealing with security, that's a winning combination.
Wow. So you're doing some super interesting things. That was my last question, Jarrod. You've been more than a great guest, and I've enjoyed speaking with you greatly. So thank you very much. Kaylin, I'm handing this over to you.
Absolutely. I just want to thank you, Jarrod, once again for being our special guest. Once again, Jarrod is a director at Shape Security, so thank you for taking the time out of your day. And Amit, to being a senior dev at Applitools, thank you so much for helping me co-host. The conversations were great, and thank you, Applitools, for sponsoring. Once again, to be able to continue having these conversations. And yeah, gentlemen, just say goodbye. I'll make sure that their Twitters, once again, are linked in the description of the YouTube and for Podbean. And my name is Kaylin, once again, and I am a marketing associate for this dot. So thank you, you two. It was great talking to you.
Thank you very much. This was fun. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
Great. Thanks, you all.